So, welcome to another episode with me, your host, Arvid Viana. And a key tool in environmental economics is cost benefit analysis of policy regulations. And the idea of cost benefit analysis is simple. For example, in air pollution, the benefit of regulations is that you get cleaner air. And as a result, people are healthier and live longer. On the other hand, reducing emissions can be costly for firms, which increases prices and leads to reduced output. Now, in an ideal world, you can balance the marginal costs imposed by regulations with their marginal benefits. But in practice, it can be a very hard problem to measure those. However, in a recent American Economic Review paper, today's guest Joe Shapiro tackled this problem in an ingenious way. So today, we will discuss his research and what it implies for whether air pollution policies in the United States are too strong or too lenient. So my guest today is Joe Shapiro. Joe is an associate professor of economics at UC Berkeley and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Energy Institute at Haas. He studies climate change, air pollution, clean energy, renewable and exhaustible natural resources, and especially water pollution. His work has links to the economics of international trade, public finance, and health, and he holds a PhD in economics from MIT. So, Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm very excited about today's topic because I've covered air pollution in China, in India, worldwide, but this is the first one on the United States. And I think there's a lot of very interesting things in your paper that I mentioned in the introduction. So maybe just to get started, could you just give us an overview of what your paper is about?
Yeah, at a high level, it's trying to use a non-standard approach to measure the marginal costs of air pollution regulation, and then to compare them against the marginal benefits of air pollution regulation. The approach we adopt is to look at a component of the Clean Air Act that's been largely overlooked in research. It's a feature which says that if a new polluting factory opens in a city, it has to pay an existing factory in the same city emitting the same pollutant to decrease its own emissions. These are offset markets, and they're useful for research because they include financial transactions where one firm is paying another firm to decrease its pollution. And those financial transactions help us understand the cost on the margin of cleaning up pollution for different cities, for different pollutants in different years.
And why do you think this was so overlooked by researchers? Because
The Clean Air Act is a defining piece of environmental legislation in the US. It's been around for half a century. It's also central in environmental economics research. Many landmark papers look at different features of the Clean Air Act. There are a number of legal and policy studies on these offset markets, and researchers for decades have said that these are some of the most important components of the Clean Air Act and its use of market-based mechanisms. The Clean Air Act has large cap and trade markets like the acid rain program for sulfur pollution from coal or the NOx budget trading program for nitrogen oxides in the eastern US. But why have people not looked at these markets? I think, I'm not sure. I'll have some conjectures. One is that each individual market is a little bit isolated. So you have a market for nitrogen oxides in San Francisco, another market for volatile organic compounds in Houston. And while there are hundreds of these markets, each one of them is just one region and one pollutant, which makes them more isolated and small than these giant national markets like the acid rain program. They've also flown under the political radar. The big cap and trade markets have been in the news for many years. They change, they get approved and shot down. And these offset markets, they were reformed by the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, but they're not a major topic of political controversy. They're not highlighted in most economics textbooks. Another possible reason is that obtaining data on them has been far from trivial. And in fact, most of the data we analyze have never been summarized or examined by academics or governments or the private sector. 2 states have laws which require public disclosure of transactions in these markets, Texas and California. For 14 other states, we purchase data from a broker, an intermediary, who helps manage these transactions. And then lastly, I think a bigger issue is that many markets for many goods are decentralized. They involve transactions from one firm to another. They don't go through a central market operator like the Chicago Mercantile Board of Exchange. And it's usually very difficult to analyze decentralized markets because you can't go to the central market operator and get a record of all transactions. You have to go to the individual firms or decentralized intermediaries. And it means that there are far fewer papers on decentralized markets with transaction data in any setting. And so the absence of research on these partly reflects that.
Cool. Thanks for that. Because I think it's a really cool collection of data that you did. Exactly because economically, these offsets are just a very nice reflection of the marginal costs. I know Steve Levitt once said, once you see a great research paper, then you're like, why hasn't this been done before? And I was like, wow, this is such a great, cool paper. So,
Thanks.
could you
If
maybe,
you want,
yeah, go
oh, go
ahead.
ahead. If you want, I can say a word about how we got into it and how we ended up writing about these, because
I,
we didn't learn about them from most of the papers on the Clean Air Act.
yeah, I would say let's come back to that. I would just
Sure.
say, just so people understand, I think in your paper you make the point that a lot of research has focused on the marginal benefits of air pollution regulation, but not the costs. Could you speak a little bit more to that so they just get a sense of where your paper is situated?
Absolutely. Let me briefly clarify what we mean by marginal costs and marginal benefits of air pollution regulation. If you go to a factory and a policy requires the factory to decrease its pollution emissions, all the cost of that cleanup are the cost of air pollution regulation. That could include installing pollution control equipment like a scrubber, labor effort to manage the equipment, materials it might require, and then some less obvious costs, like it might decrease productivity of other activities in the firm. They might produce lower quality products. They might have delays or uncertainty. They might change prices, and that could create a penalty for profits. It could affect consumers. All those are the marginal cost of air pollution policy. On the flip side of the coin, the marginal benefits are that when you decrease air pollution emissions, the ambient air quality that we breathe can become better. That can affect health and welfare outcomes like decreasing premature mortality, decreasing hospital admissions, and other measures of morbidity. It can improve child and in utero health, which might increase later lifetime human capital and earnings. It also has effects on firms, like pollution can depress agricultural yields. It can increase depreciation of capital stocks. It can cause acid rain. It can damage forests and watersheds and other ecosystem services. All those collectively, I would think of as the marginal benefits of air pollution regulation. So you're right that a very large share of environmental economics research in this domain focuses on benefits rather than costs. And there's been tremendous progress in the last half century on strategies to measure the marginal benefits of environmental regulation, especially air pollution regulation. People have developed strategies to isolate causal effects of policies. They've accounted for the idea that the health of people affected by policy might be different than the health of others. That's sometimes called short-term mortality displacement or harvesting. People have cast a wider net and included a broader set of benefits. They've used a range of different strategies like looking at land values, health, people migrating. And so there's been a really productive outpouring of research to measure the benefits of environmental policy. However, when economists or policymakers go to measure the costs of environmental policy, the prevailing methods largely have not changed in the last half century. Researchers usually use what are called engineering estimates, which means they ask an engineer to say, what is the capital cost of a piece of pollution control equipment? And what's the operating cost to have the materials and the people to keep it in service each day? And while those engineering estimates are important and informative, and they're easy to take off the shelf, they have many limitations. They're not revealed preference. So that means that when firms actually use this equipment in practice, it might have costs quite different than an engineer or an accountant would estimate. It also ignores all those other channels I mentioned: delays, uncertainty, frictions, impact on quality, price. And there are a few isolated papers proposing other methods to look at the cost of environmental policy. But the other methods are not very widely adopted, and they're often measuring the total cost of a very broad set of environmental regulations. And it's much more challenging to use other methods to measure the marginal cost of a small change in regulation. And that's important because to know optimal policy, we need to compare costs and benefits at the margin. We don't just want to look at the last half century and say we spent trillions of dollars. Was that in total worthwhile?
First, I'll just say I'll cut this out, but I thought this was a great explanation. This is really nice. So
Thanks.
that's I I don't know. It seems like you've done this many times before for the paper.
I did teach this paper in my graduate class not
Yeah.
too long ago, and I presented this paper a few times. But I think that general idea, I and Reed have a couple other papers. I don't think we recognize that on day zero of the paper, that there's so many more papers on benefits than costs. But in the process of writing it, the foil is often engineering estimates. And at some point I realized, and we even included a miniature literature review, most of the progress is on ways to measure marginal benefits. And policymakers have started to adopt some of those methods, and much less is on ways to measure marginal costs that are widely adopted.
Yeah. And then to transition that, so one of the contributions of your paper is exactly getting to these marginal costs, which then allows you to compare, well, the marginal benefits to the marginal costs to get a sense of like, is it too lenient or not? So what did you find in terms of comparing these marginal benefits to existing marginal costs?
Let me quickly say how we measured marginal benefits, because I don't think we've talked about that.
Sure.
Many estimates combine how do pollution emissions affect air quality, how does air quality affect mortality, what is the valuation of mortality expressed through the value of a statistical life. So we take several leading models that make those calculations. We also take several different estimates of the value of a statistical life, and we aggregate them so that we can say, for these markets, how do they affect mortality and health, and what's the value in dollars, and then compare those estimates of marginal benefits against estimates of marginal costs that come from the offset financial transactions. A broad benefit of our approach is that we don't have only one number for the whole country. We can obtain different estimates of marginal benefits and costs for each pollutant, for each city, for each year. Our broad takeaway is, in most markets, the marginal benefits of cleaning up pollution are more than 10 times larger than the marginal costs of cleaning up pollution. That would suggest that environmental regulation, as currently expressed in these markets, is too lenient. It's allowing more pollution than would be optimal, because the benefits remain so large at the margin and the costs remain reasonably modest. That's true for most markets. It's not true for every single market. The clearest exception is in Houston. The market for volatile organic compounds sticks out a bit like a sore thumb. It's maybe the Taylor Swift of offsets, where demand is enormous, supply is very limited, and then prices become quite large. There's an interesting story for that particular market, which is in the late 2000s, hydraulic fracturing developed new technologies to extract natural gas. That made U.S. natural gas prices become quite low. The industries that use natural gas as an input had great reason to expand. Houston is a center of many of those industries. So there was suddenly a boom in expansion of petrochemical and ethylene and other factories that use natural gas as their primary input, because gas was so cheap. So all of these quite large factories wanted to open in Houston. They started paying incumbents to decrease pollution, and they quite quickly marched up the marginal abatement cost curve. They picked the low-hanging fruit for cleaning up pollution, and then the remaining opportunities became much more expensive, even though the marginal benefits didn't change. But that's just Houston. And most of the other markets, the marginal benefits of cleaning up pollution are an order of magnitude larger than the marginal costs.
And two things to that. One, I think that example illustrates very nicely the upward, sloping marginal abatement cost curve, which we sometimes see, but it's hard to measure. So it's like a very nice example of it and seeing it in action. And then two, maybe getting back to the marginal benefits, because one thing that you find is exactly these marginal benefits are much higher than the marginal costs. One thing listeners might not be fully aware of is how you calculate those. So maybe could you talk a little bit more about how you get from reduced or the improved health effects, like say on mortality, to the estimation of dollars?
Yeah. We use several different models in an effort to ensure that the results are robust. Each of the models has similar structure. The way they work is they say, suppose that you emit 1 ton of a specific pollutant from a specific county. For example, suppose you emit a ton of volatile organic compounds from Houston. And I'll say non-environmental people might wonder, what are volatile organic compounds? There are dozens of chemicals that create ground level smog. If you ever spill gasoline at the gas station and you smell some nasty fumes, that's what those chemicals are. They're things like benzene and toluene that increase cancer risks. So the way these analyses measure the marginal benefits of cleaning up pollution is they say, suppose you're emitting 1 ton of volatile organic compounds from Houston. First, we would like to know how that changes ambient air pollution, not only in Houston, but all the regions around Texas and the rest of the country, because wind and atmospheric chemistry takes pollution emitted in one location and then can disperse it to many other locations. Once these models understand the change in ambient air quality, they then ask, how does that affect health and welfare outcomes like mortality and morbidity and crop yields? And to estimate those, it uses concentration response functions from epidemiology and economics. It then takes each of the endpoints like mortality, morbidity, and crop yields, and it assigns a dollar value to them. For mortality, which is by far the most important in dollar terms, the approach to doing that is to take estimates of what's called the value of a statistical life. It's an estimate of people's willingness to pay to decrease mortality risk by a certain percentage. It's estimated in a variety of ways. The most common is to look at wages of different occupations and say, for example, somebody washing windows on a 100th floor gets higher wages than somebody who's washing windows on the first floor, or coal miners versus secretaries. We then sum up all of the damages across all the locations that are expressed in dollar terms and call those the marginal benefit of abatement or the marginal damages of emissions. I will note that one of these leading models, the AP3 model, has included all the different categories I mentioned and more: mortality, morbidity, crop yields, and ends up finding that mortality accounts for more than 95% of the benefits. So the headline numbers that we mention only include mortality. In the sensitivity analyses, we discuss adding some of the other benefits, but they're so small, they're not the same order of magnitude as mortality.
So we've talked about the marginal benefits. One thing you mentioned in the beginning is these engineering estimates are not revealed preferences. How do those estimates you estimated through offsets compared to engineering estimates? Did you do some comparison?
It's a good question. We did in previous drafts of the paper. We removed most of that comparison in the final draft, mostly for space reasons, but I can summarize what we did and how we found, even though it's not in the final version. There's a national set of engineering estimates that goes by the acronym COST. The Environmental Protection Agency and several California regulatory agencies and others use this national model. It has a list of factories and power plants and other pollution sources, and an inventory of the pollution control equipment installed in each source. It also has a list of other possible equipment each source could potentially install, along with capital and operating and maintenance costs for each possible technology a plant could install. So the way we did the comparison was to look at the plants engaging in these transactions and look at the offset prices. That's our revealed preference estimate. And then we took this engineering model and said, what does the engineering model say they could install and what would the costs be? And our takeaway was that the engineering model was really all over the map. It had not zero, but very little relationship to the revealed preference estimates. We looked in detail at the engineering model. We also interviewed regulators and engineers who have worked with it. We think one of the major limitations of that model is enormously incomplete data on the pollution controls technologies that are actually installed and on the set that would be available. When we ask people, how do you choose what technology to install, a lot of practical considerations are relevant, like space and physical layout of the plant will often determine what's feasible, and this engineering model has no knowledge of it. It also, for many plants, would recommend ridiculously cheap pollution control technology on the order of $50 a ton on the assumption that no plants had it. In reality, many of the plants did have it, and it was not in the model. And then a final limitation is that many of the technologies were out of date, so it would recommend information that was current as of the 1980s, which is the last it was updated, But as of 2010, the situation on the ground is quite different. It's important to note that in a very specific setting, an engineer may have better information about an individual plant than the EPA has nationally from this kind of model. However, if the federal government or a federal regulator is making national decisions on policy, they can't send an engineer in real time to hundreds or thousands of plants around the world to conduct a study. They have to use these national models. So if it's informative, I could give sort of an anecdotal comparison about what the difference is between revealed preference and engineering and other approaches for this kind of calculation. Let me just try to give you some numbers to illustrate what the difference might be. Uh, our national calculation is that across all the markets with data, looking at one important pollutant, nitrogen oxides, if you decrease emissions by 1 ton, it creates $40,000 to $50,000 in health and welfare benefits. It means there's
Yeah.
less mortality, there's less morbidity, and if you value it, it means people are getting $40,000 to $50,000 in benefits. If you look at offset prices, the average firm is receiving only $1,000 to $4,000 for decreasing emissions of NOx by 1 ton. And that immediately says the incentive to firms is way too weak. We're only offering them a couple $1,000s, but the benefits to society are tens of thousands of dollars. So just that immediate comparison says these regulations are more lenient than is optimal. It would optimally be more stringent. And when we look at engineering calculations, the same qualitative pattern emerges that the marginal benefits are much larger than offset prices and marginal costs, but the actual ratios fluctuate wildly depending which market you're looking at, which technology, and which plants.
Because I think that's a nice bridge to then get to the question of, you've established that marginal benefits are still much higher than marginal costs. So in some sense, the current policies are too lenient.
Yep.
And you've talked to people, also I get from the EPA. What was your impression of, why do you think, has there not been more awareness that the marginal benefits still might be higher than the marginal costs? I don't know if that makes sense. It's like, if given
Yeah.
that we've got a better understanding of these marginal benefits, they're still very high. Why has there not been like more awareness among U.S. citizens, say that we should increase the stringency of some of these regulations? I don't know if that makes sense or
Yeah.
not, or because it's
Yeah.
or like, why, if after reading your paper, is there not more awareness?
Some environmental economists like to say that it is an easy subject to teach because there are so many policies that sound absolutely crazy as written. One example that people sometimes give is components of the Clean Air Act that say it is illegal to consider costs of policy in assigning regulations. And courts have upheld versions of that where they say all that matters is whether this regulation is creating benefits. The costs are illegal to consider. There are parts of the Clean Air Act that consider costs, but there are many other parts that say they cannot be compared. So there was never a pretense that the goal of setting up the Clean Air Act, from the lawyer's perspective, was to equate marginal benefits and costs. They had lots of other goals. They wanted it to be legally enforceable and defensible. In the 1970s, the goal was just bring pollution down. There also have not been a lot of comparisons of marginal benefits and costs in the past. And our paper is not written in a vacuum. We recognize that policy is a political entity. Making regulation more or less stringent can create winners and losers. It's also important in the political economy spectrum that the winners may be diffuse and might not know it. Somebody who gets sick or dies, or an infant who has lower growth because of air pollution, it's often not obvious. One day with extreme wildfire pollution, that's quite obvious. But decades of exposures to moderate levels of pollution, it's quite hard to say. Sometimes philosophers distinguish identified from statistical lives. Somebody who passes away, where you know the name and the person, there's justifiably an enormous amount of empathy and sadness and sympathy, but many hundreds of thousands of people who are dying because of air pollution, it's often difficult to say exactly whose death was caused by air pollution, because the actual cause of death on the death certificate is not air pollution. It's cardiovascular disease, heart attack, COPD, lung cancer. Whereas it's easy to identify the firms that have to pay costs. So we're delving into political economy, but why do people not focus on the comparison of benefits and costs? I think it might not be universally known. And if it is, it's a political decision. It's not purely a technocratic decision.
I think this was just such a nice explanation of. I feel like this is the thing people need to hear more of, like exactly like getting it out there. In some sense, when I talk to like in India, it's still or China, it was like if the air pollution is so visible, then it just gets more attention. Whereas like if once you get to the lower levels, maybe like you say for all types of these things, it's just like a lower threshold. Maybe then earlier you said to talk maybe about the story of how you and Reed got to work on this topic.
Yeah, there were two sources that I recall. One was many years ago, maybe 6 or 7. Reed and Walker and I have written a series of papers on the Clean Air Act and associated policy. And at one point, he asked me, "Hey, Joe, have you heard of this part of the Clean Air Act? It's called emissions reductions credits. That's the technical name of offsets. Plants have to pay each other to emit pollution." And I said, "Sounds strange. Never heard of it." And maybe we traded a couple of emails, but that was the end of that. And then a year or two later, I saw a newspaper article about a plant that had invested in some pollution reduction. And the newspaper article mentioned that then it earned $1 million by selling credits. And I thought, what was that? And then I looked into it, and it was these emissions reductions credits. And then I reached back out to Reed and said, "Is this the market that you're talking about? Plants are making $1 million by reducing pollution?" And then we did what we probably should have done on day zero, which was to look around to understand these markets better, and found the California and Texas data. And then it seemed like a gold mine, where there were thousands of bilateral transactions where firms were trading pollution for dollars, which rarely happens.
Yeah.
The reason environmental economics is about externalities is that most environmental goods are not traded in markets. Policymakers have to create markets to have incentives for them. So often people refer to externalities as missing markets. Anytime where a market is created, there's opportunity to look at prices and quantities and do what economists do in standard markets, like for soda and yogurt, estimate demand and supply and equilibrium. So it's an unusual opportunity to stumble into thousands of financial transactions for air pollution at the heart of the Clean Air Act. So I think pretty quickly once we saw that, we thought that it could be a natural way to learn about marginal costs. And then many scholars have worked with measures as marginal benefits that seem like a natural counterpoint.
And yeah, because one thing I also got while reading your paper is that you've done a lot of interviews with people like on the ground, these brokers, the people buying this, the regulators. Did you get a sense that it wasn't a deal breaker that these offsets were there? Because you mentioned the abatement costs go up, and sometimes they can go high. Because I can imagine opponents of like making the Clean Air Act more stringent would say, look, we're going to prevent firms coming into our region, or we're going to stifle growth. Was that like a concern of among people that you talk to, like that if you were to like make it drastically more stringent, suddenly like this marginal abatement cost would shoot up, that it just would become like this preventative cost of firms, because we're talking about the marginal cost. If you get like a large firm coming in, they would have to buy a lot of these offsets.
I've heard mixed anecdotes about that. I think decades ago, policymakers and maybe academics had the belief that if they required firms to install strict pollution control technology, firms would do it and that's all that would happen. And I think that idea has been blown out of the water by a lot of research showing that firms have many margins where they can respond. They can exit, they can not enter, they can switch products, they can use less energy. There's a whole range of responses. They can produce less output, they can fire workers, they can invest less. So pollution control is an immediate and important response. It's certainly not the only one. In this market, we absolutely heard anecdotes of ways that firms respond, which are other than just installing a piece of pollution control equipment. There were anecdotes about multinational firms considering opening in a market and observing offset prices and then changing plans because of it. And some of the change in plans would be to make the plant smaller, so they would have to buy fewer offsets, to enter in a market where prices were lower, to install additional pollution control technology. Those are all optimizing responses. And you could debate whether they're what policymakers intend or want. In a sense, they're decreasing pollution. And if decreasing pollution has large benefits relative to costs, then there can be a wide range of decisions firms make to decrease pollution, not only building a box that captures pollution before it enters the
Yeah.
smokestack. I will say that it was fascinating to talk to policymakers and brokers and environmental managers at Fortune 500 companies. And I try in every paper where I can to find connections to people in the market and talk to them. Or in this case, I just cold called every market participant I could find in Houston, which was a pretty interesting day. And you just learn a lot of color about the markets. It makes research more relevant. I always have this moment where I hold my breath when I'm talking to the people who are actually in a market after studying it for a few years and think,
Yeah.
have I completely mischaracterized what's happening? And I think every time it's been reaffirming that I understood the market pretty well, but then there were details that I didn't fully understand. But usually people are excited to learn about what's happening. They don't have the bandwidth to do this kind of analysis. And then they have a lot of great anecdotes to help
Yeah.
understand how things work.
Cool. Then, was there something that surprised you during all of this that you hadn't expected ex ante?
I think the magnitude and systematic differences between marginal benefits and costs was striking. The enormous exceptionalism of Houston volatile organic compounds was surprising. The explanation of it and the attribution to fracking made a lot of sense. I also think before writing the paper, I didn't appreciate the dearth of methods that economists and policymakers have to measure marginal costs. Writing this helped me appreciate that offset markets are an appealing setting to learn about those costs. Offset markets have their own quirks. They're different than cap and trade markets. They're another flavor of quantity restriction. It helped open my eyes to the idea that there are many environmental markets around the world that aren't cap and trade and pollution taxes. Looking at them might yield some insights to learn about environmental goods in those other settings.
Awesome. Then maybe two final questions. My final question generally is, what question could I have asked you that I haven't asked you yet? But I generally finish on that just to prime it. The other one is, I think one element I also got is, in an idealized world, but this is my idealized world, is, you could have these regulations that vary by region or county. But the other thing is that the regulation, I think you mentioned in the paper, is set nationally. So there's no control over it. Um, would that be, do you feel like that would be an ideal where you could have some regulation by a more narrow geographic region if you were to like design it? Or I don't know if this is in the scope, but I was thinking about is if you were to design this from a.
There are a lot of economics papers that look at environmental policy and say, wow, this is inefficient and suboptimal and poorly designed. Look at the crazy policies we have. That's a very common type of conclusion. I increasingly feel that being cognizant of the political economy of environmental policy can add insight to those kind of conclusions, besides just saying, hey, this policy is inefficient. And recognizing political economy, there's a trade off to allowing local policy. It does allow for more flexibility that could tailor to local circumstances. It might also make regulatory capture easier. It
Yeah.
makes political sway quite relevant. So local elections can sway
Yeah,
policies
yeah,
back and
yeah.
forth. So a feature of the Clean Air Act is that it ties the hands of local regulators. If their air is polluted, the Clean Air Act does not give them a choice. They have to regulate more strictly. And as this paper is trying to show, it's doing it with a pretty rough tool, which is not perfectly tailored to be optimal. On the other hand, it's certainly a welfare gain relative to doing nothing or weaker
Mhm.
policy. And the more flexibility you allow, the more differences you may have in
Very
policy across
comprehensive.
jurisdictions. In addition, on top of what the federal government is doing, many local governments have a wide swath of air pollution regulation. There's a paper I like from a couple decades ago that just looks at oil refinery regulations of air pollution for oil refineries in Los Angeles. And this paper counted more than 40 individual local regulations for oil refineries emitting air pollution. So that's ignoring state and federal policies. It's ignoring water pollution. It's ignoring other industries. So and Los Angeles is one of the most tightly regulated environmental settings in the country. But it's not that every place is doing exactly the same thing. It's that the Clean Air Act has some degree of uniformity, and then local governments can add
Yeah.
on top of it.
Thanks. I think that was actually helpful for me. I think it's some very good points of, as an economist, like, yeah, why don't we optimize it? Like you say, there's this huge trade-off in flexibility and regulatory capture. Yeah, like, is there anything else you want to say about the paper that we haven't covered that you'd like to highlight?
I think the only thing I'll say is that this is an ongoing conversation. Every 5 years, the federal government is required by the Clean Air Act to evaluate the available evidence and determine if air pollution standards should be tighter. And then there's a kind of Groundhog Day discussion about conservatives saying this is job killing and liberals saying this is essential for the environment. So the more opportunities there are to understand the health and welfare consequences and the cost of controlling pollution, the easier it is to have that discussion about the trade-offs. But the discussion keeps happening, and it's going to keep happening because the letter of the law says every 5 years we need to reevaluate. It's not just the US, many other countries have their own Clean Air Act that have some similar features. Some of them were inspired by or based on the US Clean Air Act. So even though we wrote this paper here, partly given the 7N data, the same kind of issue happens in lots of places, and it's informative to learn about what the trade-offs are like elsewhere.
All right, then I would say I think your paper definitely is contributing to the fact that we can have more informed conversations about this. So thanks for the paper and thanks for taking the time for the conversation.
Sure. Thanks for reaching out and great questions. It's fun to chat.
This is the end of the episode. I'd like to thank you for listening all the way to the end. And if you have any advice on how to improve the podcast or advice on future guests or episodes or ideas, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. Have a great day.